you all for having me here tonight. There's nothing more I like talking about than military women and women veterans, except maybe my Kentucky Wildcats. And I get to go into full mode with them tomorrow night in the NCAA tournament, so I can be concentrated on this evening. Can we do the next slide? Military women are near and dear to my heart, and that's probably because I was one. Next slide. Next slide. Some of the best years of my life were spent as a Navy WAVE. Now, the WAVE stands for Women Accepted for Volunteer Emergency Service. As a matter of fact, it was 52 years ago last November that I raised my right hand and promised to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. Next slide. That happens to be underneath the portrait of Robert E. Lee. Next slide. This was not a spur-of-the-moment decision. I had decided at the age of 6 that I was going to join the Navy, and I never made a plan B. I'm certain that an old World War II movie that was called So Proudly We Hail had a great deal to do with my decision. Now, it had Claudette Colbert and Veronica Lake in it, and George Reeve, the original Superman, if any of y'all remember him. I don't know why it made me want to join the Navy, because it was about Army nurses on Bataan, but Navy it was. Opening night of the American Nurses Association convention when I was 12 sealed the deal. There was a great deal of pageantry involved, and it was held at the Atlantic City Convention Center. You know, where they used to have the Miss America pageant? The head of each of the military services nurse corps processed in wearing their dinner dress uniforms. They were all impressive. Next slide, please. But the Navy dinner dress uniform has a tiara in place of a hat. Need I say more?
I didn't tell my sister and hers.
Next slide. I arrived at Recruit Training Command, Bainbridge, Maryland on Friday, the 13th of November. It was after lights off, and there was a very scary woman standing there on the quarter deck, screaming 3 numbers at me that I would have memorized by 05:30 the next morning. My first thought was, Donna, what have you gotten yourself into? My granddaughter Lauren is also a veteran, having served in the Air Force, and I told her if she didn't feel the same way at the end of her first day, something was wrong. By the way, those 3 numbers were my service number, my company number, and my social security number. And if you pulled me up out of a dead sleep, I can still give you all 3 of them. Next slide, please. There have been over 3 million women who have served in the military since the American Revolution. Now, some of you here know that every good DAR member knows the story of Deborah Sampson. For those who don't, she's the lady in the middle who disguised herself as a man and served during the American Revolution. You can probably see why she didn't have a hard time disguising herself. Deborah was not the most attractive person out there. Everything was fine until she was severely wounded, and that's when her gender was discovered. However, she was honorably discharged, and later she applied for and received a pension for her service. I thought I was a part of history when women were first ordered aboard non-hospital ships in 1978, but I was incorrect. I discovered that Mary Marshall and Mary Allen served as nurses aboard the USS United States during the War of 1812. Women were barred from serving in the military during the Civil War, but more than 400 disguised themselves as men to fight on both sides of the conflict. Dr. Mary Walker, the lady in the middle and the bottom, the only woman to receive the Medal of Honor, was awarded this honor for her service during the Civil War. By the way, she later had it taken away from her because they didn't feel she deserved it, but it was reinstated. They also called her Contrary Mary. Next slide. Another woman of note during the Civil War was Clara Barton, who was credited with establishing the Red Cross. Her exploits and efforts were locally at Chatham were publicized far and wide. It's also good to take note of the fact that Clara was her own best publicist. Most of the stories that are told about Clara originated with Clara. She first visited Chatham, known as the Lacey House, during the war in early August of 1862. She brought food and supplies that she had collected to help her boys. They were all camped in the vicinity of the house. She returned to Chatham later in the Fredericksburg campaign in December of that year of 1862. She again brought supplies and was assigned a room in the house. She comforted soldiers from both sides of the conflict. A physician requested her help in the city, and as she stepped off the pontoon bridge, an officer offered her his hand. A shell passed under their arms, tearing away part of her skirt and his coat tail. Soon afterwards, Clara saw the dead body of that same officer. Since the doctors were too busy to keep medical records during the battle, she wrote in her diary the names of the men who died at Chatham and where they were buried. Barton wrote she saw hundreds of the worst wounded men I have ever seen. The wounded occupied every room of the house and covered every foot of the floors and porticos. She recorded that they laid on the stairs and the landings, and a man thought himself rich if he had laid under a table where he would not be stepped on. She noticed 5 men stuffed onto 4 shelves of a cupboard. Still, 12,000 square foot building did not contain enough space to hold all the wounded. Many were placed on blankets in the muddy yard where they shivered in the cold December air as they waited for someone inside to die to create a space for them. Clara set up a soup kitchen in a tent in the yard to help those wounded soldiers. Next slide. Now, anyone who's been around the Daughters of the American Revolution for more than 10 minutes knows that if there's a crisis or an emergency or even any kind of need, the DAR will be there. It's just what we do. That was never truer than at the start of the Spanish-American War in April of 1898. When the war began, the Army had only male nurses. The problem was that they turned out to be extremely inefficient. Enter Dr. Anita Newcomb McGee. This woman was already a rule breaker and was setting a new standard for women in medicine. She was only the 3rd woman to ever graduate from the Columbian College, which is now George Washington University. To say that she was independent was an understatement. After training in Europe for 3 years and studying at Cambridge and Geneva, Switzerland, she graduated from medical school and gained additional specialized training in obstetrics and gynecology at Johns Hopkins University, which was not exactly a hotbed of female education at that time. She was also a rising star in the DAR. she had served as Librarian General, Vice President General, and finally, Surgeon General. Between the Civil War and Spanish-American War, Army nurses was done entirely by men. Recognizing the need for increased numbers of trained nurses to meet the demands of war, the real Secretary of War authorized the Surgeon General to employ nurses under contract. Dr. McGee was convinced that only well-qualified nurses, whether men or women, should be accepted. She therefore offered the services of the NSDAR to act as an examining board for the Army. As a result, Dr. McGee became the director of the DAR Hospital Corps in April of 1898. From August 20th, 1898 to the end of 1900, she accepted the appointment of acting Assistant Surgeon General in the United States Army. This was an extremely unique position for any woman in those days, and at that time, she was the only woman authorized to wear an Army officer uniform. Dr. McGee wrote the standards and criteria for those nurses. She said that they should be well-trained, in good health, and between the ages of 30 and 50, so that they would be mature enough to handle the rigors of the situations they would be facing. This was rather ironic considering the fact that Dr. McGee herself was only 23 years old. Wow. Originally, there were 50 nurses selected for the Spanish-American War, with the DAR serving as the screening body for these nurses. Later on, there were over 5,000 applicants, of which 1,500 were selected. Dr. McGee and the DAR set up an office on F Street in order to continue the process of selecting qualified candidates. A little known fact about these nurses is that because they were contractors, they were not eligible for veteran benefits or care. Because of that, the original nurses received DAR pensions for the rest of their lives. After the war, Dr. McGee helped pass legislation and drafted the regulations that officially established the Army Nurse Corps. Many of those regulations are still in effect today. She went on to form the Society of Spanish-American War Nurses and served as its president. There is a memorial located in Arlington National Cemetery dedicated to these nurses. In 1967, the DAR established the Dr. Anita Newcomb McGee Outstanding Army Nurse Award, and it is presented each year on National Defense Night at Continental Congress. Next slide. Dr. McGee died from a cerebral hemorrhage in October of 1940 at the age of 75. For her service, it took some finagling, but she was given a funeral with full military honors and is buried at Arlington National Cemetery. Next slide, please. More than 35,000 women served during World War I. There were also more than 400 casualties. The outstanding work done by these women had a significant influence on the passage of the 19th Amendment, giving women the right to vote. Even though these women had served with distinction, they were all discharged at the end of the war. They were told, "Thank you, ladies. Now go home and put your aprons back on." It was not until 1948, when Congress passed the Women's Armed Services Integration Act, that women were granted permanent status as far as military service was concerned, and the first time women were eligible for veterans benefits. This year, we celebrate the 75th anniversary of that legislation. But in many ways, women veterans are still basically invisible. During the Korean conflict, over 50,000 women served both stateside and overseas. More than 500 Army and Navy nurses served in combat MASH units and aboard hospital ships. Next slide, please. Now we come to the time I'm most familiar with, and that's the Vietnam War. This era in American history was a time of great turmoil, but it was also a time of great change, especially as it applied to women serving on active military duty. Also, when most people think about the Vietnam War, they think about men who served there. For some of us women veterans, that ruffles our feathers a bit. As a matter of fact, during the Vietnam era, more than 197,500 women answered the call to serve. Now we know all of them were volunteers, because women are not subject to the draft in this country. Of course, some 7,500 actually served in Vietnam, and about 6,000 of those women being nurses and medical specialists. These are the women I'm personally excited about receiving recognition and honor, and to whom I want to say thank you, especially during this period of the Vietnam War 50th commemoration. Several years ago at the Virginia DAR State Regents Luncheon, I heard Lieutenant General Wilson talk about the strides and changes that have taken place in the military as it pertains to women serving. The Vietnam era was the beginning of massive changes and the opening of new career paths for women. What she failed to mention was the fact that these changes were met with great resistance from the military establishment. And every single one of those changes required a lawsuit against the government before they took place. Thankfully, we were not deterred. And as a side note, I just attended yesterday the birthday party for General Wilma Vaught, who was the first director of the Women's Memorial at Arlington, who celebrated her 93rd birthday yesterday. And if you ever want to deal with a woman who's got it together, that's General Vaught. If you've watched the news in recent years, you know that we now have our first female Army Rangers. They graduated in August of 2019. And some people may question why a woman would put herself through such agony. I understand it perfectly. Those women are trailblazers. And I say, you go, girl. I myself had the privilege of being the first female to receive orders to the Philippines, but that was a long time ago. Just last fall, I took my 11-year-old granddaughter to see the Blue Angels at the Oceana Naval Air Station. She was really excited because the Blue Angels have selected their first female member in the performing squad. I saw on the news this past week that Lieutenant Amanda Lee has completed her initial training and has flown in her first air show of the 2023 season. Natalie wants to be a Navy fighter pilot after she graduates from the Naval Academy. And as excited as she was about the Blue Angels, she was over the moon when she got to meet 2 female fighter pilots who took the time to talk to her and show her the cockpit of their new F-35 tactical fighter jet. I can tell you that she drank the Kool-Aid. But I digress. Once PTSD was recognized as a mental disorder requiring treatment, service women were excluded from that category because obviously none of us could ever have experienced anything while we were on active duty to qualify for that diagnosis. That's far from true. It took 23 years to overcome that obstacle, and women became eligible for a PTSD diagnosis. Next slide, please. From the opening days of Desert Storm and Operation Iraqi Freedom until today, we have women now serving side by side with their male counterparts on the front lines in combat. We now have female fighter pilots and women who command combat wings and ground units. I can't tell you how proud that makes me. When I joined the Navy, if you got married, you were out. Then, if you got married, your husband could not be your dependent. And you were not eligible for base housing. If you got pregnant, you were out. Then it progressed to ask to be able to stay in. Then you could ask to get out if you became pregnant. Thankfully, by the time my daughter was born, if you became pregnant, you had your baby, went on maternity leave, and you went back to work. As a matter of fact, the day the American embassy was taken in Tehran, all independent duty trained hospital corps personnel were called to the conference room at the hospital in Quantico. The commanding officer told us to have our sea bags packed by 0600 the next morning. When the meeting was over, I said, "Skipper, I hate to spring this on you, but I'm 6 months pregnant." He replied, "Have your sea bag packed by 0600 tomorrow morning." We had come a long way.
Yeah, we have.
Not long ago on Facebook, I saw a posting about plans the Pentagon had for having all 18-year-olds, both male and female, register for the draft. Most females who responded basically said, "Bring it on." A number of men said things like, "You women want equality? Let's see how you like that." I thought that was rather ironic considering the fact that there have been over 3 million women who have served this country since the days of the American Revolution, and every single one of them has been a willing volunteer. The Women's Military Memorial at the front gate of Arlington Cemetery has the registered stories of almost 300,000 women. I have met families visiting the memorial who have told me they never knew their mother was a veteran until after she died, and they found her military papers among her belongings. There are over 109,000 women veterans in the state of Virginia, and more than 3,700 right here in Stafford County. Many of these women never seek or claim their veteran benefits or associate with any veteran group. Next slide. My military service provided me with an incredible opportunity. I had the chance to be a pioneer. As I told you before, I was the first woman ordered into Subic Bay in the Philippines. I served aboard the hospital ship Sanctuary in Vietnam. When women were first ordered to duty aboard surface ships, I was there on a destroyer tender and a guided missile frigate. I had the privilege of serving on the White House medical staff under Presidents Ford and Carter, and I thought I would freeze to death the day Ronald Reagan was inaugurated. Active duty military service was gratifying. Veteran status, not so much. When I first left the Navy, I looked into membership in both the American Legion and the VFW. Both of those organizations told me I was not welcome, but I could feel free to join the auxiliary. Now, don't get me wrong, the auxiliaries do tremendous work, but I was not a military spouse. I don't remember the exact verbiage, but I believe I told them they were free to place their offer in a dark place. When Golden Corral first first began having Military Appreciation Day around Veterans Day, several of our friends went to dinner with my husband and I. All three men were, offered their free meals, and the cashier began to ring up 3 buffets for the wives. I said, wait, I'm also a veteran. The cashier said, do you have any proof? I said, you didn't ask the men for proof.
Right.
Her reply was, well, we expect them to be veterans. Luckily, I had come prepared with my DD-214, which were my discharge papers. I expressed my displeasure to the manager, and not only was my dinner free, but he gave me a certificate for 2 more. There have been times I have found that I can stand in a store with a veteran's t-shirt and my ball cap on, asking for my discount. And the cashier will say, I'm sorry, you can't use your husband's discount. Really? Are you kidding me? Some people have accused me of being a little bit feisty. I have no idea where that reputation comes from. I can tell you one of my 3 Navy nicknames, and that one was Martha Military. The other 2 wouldn't be appropriate here. And I do have to admit, because of some of these instances, there are times I go looking for confrontation. Sometimes it always seems to happen at Lowe's. I park in the veterans parking spot, and when I get out and start walking towards the store, more often than not, some man will say, hey! Not even, hey lady, or excuse me ma'am. It's just, hey. Just because your husband is a veteran doesn't mean you can park there. That's when I get a little smile on my face. And I say, you are correct. My husband was a veteran, and I'm proud of that. But let me tell you something, Skippy. I served 3 times as long as he did. So that means I can park anywhere I please. That's usually followed by, oh, okay. I do have to admit that's quite satisfying. Currently, I have the privilege of serving as the National Vice Chairman of the DAR Service for Veterans Committee, Women Veterans and Extended Services. I think it's the best job in all of DAR because there's no group I care about more than women veterans. The needs of women veterans go largely unnoticed. You may not know this, but the fastest growing group of veterans without stable housing are women, especially single mothers with children. The DAR is an organization that does exceptional work in all phases of support for veterans. Next slide, please. These are 2 of the ladies I had contact me before I came, who are also veterans here in Stafford County. Sue Henderson and Carrie Pierce, who's here with us this evening. Both of them served in the Air Force, and they enlisted during the 80s and 90s. Sue is the CEO of her own company, and Carrie served a 20-plus year career. As much as things have improved, these women have experienced the same thing as veterans 20 and 30 years later. Both are very proud of their service, but don't appreciate being invisible. I'm very proud to tell you that Ms. Carrie Pierce, tomorrow evening at the Virginia DAR State Conference, is going to be recognized as the outstanding DAR veteran volunteer for the year. And she deserves it. In closing, I'd like to tell you how a few years ago I attended a reunion of Navy waves who went through basic training at Bay Ridge, Maryland. We all met in San Diego. There were women there who enlisted during the 50s, 60s, and 70s. The local ABC News channel came to interview us, and they asked if we would raise our right hand again. Every woman there responded with a resounding yes. In fact, those who had not remained on active duty indicated that leaving the military was their biggest regret. The most gratifying part of that experience was the fact that almost 20 young women who were currently stationed on active duty in San Diego saw that broadcast and came to the hotel to thank us for blazing a trail for them. They actually realized that because of what we had endured, they were able to have the careers of their choosing without question today. That made it all more worthwhile. And I have to tell you that, to tell the truth, if they gave me the chance, I'd go back today, gray hair and all. Next slide. Thank you for having me.